an overview of what is, I think, is happening in Catholic thought these days. Now, in order to assist us with that, we had a handout that is going to, one can follow along with. This is the one here that says overview and my name, introduction, and so on. Now, as soon as we take up a whole idea here is to do an academic and objective study of the thing we're calling Catholic thought. And as soon as you begin to do that, enter into a different ball game, as it were. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein taught us that there are different language games that apply to different realities. So for many of us, this is spring training time, and if we talk about batting averages or balls and strikes or the pennant race, or how many RBIs someone will get, or someone hit a Ruthian home run, some of us understand the vocabulary. It's all, I mean, those are odd words, Ruthian, and yet there's a lot of people who understand what that means, and what the historical reference is. Now, it's the same way when we begin to move into what we're calling here Catholic thought. It has its own language game, its own vocabulary, and so on. Now, one of the important things that will help us in all of this is the glossary in the text. And so you're reminded of that in the large volume there, the textbook in the back. It lists a lot of these terms. So if you hear me say things, you don't understand them, don't get the words, very often it will be in the glossary, and one will be able to look it up and find out more about that. Also, one needs sort of historical background to understand something like we're calling Catholic thought. And so the handouts that are on the back of that sheet we're looking at now, we turn the page over, see background material for the first lecture that I'm giving, and we find a lot of material there. And things that save you writer's cramp and so on, but it is to sort of get into the ball game, to begin to follow along with this world that we're calling Catholic thought. So you begin to see right away the importance, and the value and importance of theology, something about all of that. You see what the theology is trying to do, what that word's about, faith-seeking understanding, the classic definition, and so on. Let's do that then. When you have a new field, the ideas don't come down out of the sky, but they're generated from sources. So you have sources listed there, the major one being the Bible, the many books that make up this one library that we call a Bible, great councils in the church, as you see there, some of them listed, teachings of the hierarchy, ongoing life of the church, and so on. Then in the next column, when the speakers are here, they will often refer to the great theologians in history. And you see a listing there of some of the important ones that we'll be referring to. And now it's not impossible to learn those names. Some of them will be on the quiz for Thursday. And so one is should begin to see who these people are. The most important ones being the ones listed there first: Origen, Augustine, Aquinas, Newman, and the one we will hear most about, I suppose, throughout the course, Paul Rahner, who's listed there at number 5, and will be the major influence on my own thinking. Then you see some of the other theologians who are operative today. Okay, that is just to alert you to this sort of language game, this vocabulary, and it's not impossible. One can understand it, get a hold of the names, know the major terminology, and so on, and thus listen intelligently to what is going on when we have these major lectures. So I want to begin now with that sort of background in mind to look at the question of what is this word Catholic all about that we're talking about here? I intend to do an overview of current trends in Catholic thought. So the overview idea is I'm taking a broad-based approach, talking about major things that I think are going on. I'm talking about trends, especially since the Second Vatican Council, major meeting of the Catholic bishops, 1962 to 1965. Good to have that clear in one's mind. That is what has inaugurated a lot of the changes that we know and what the trends are today. Vatican II, we often call it, Second Vatican Council. So we need to think in those current terms. Now, when we start to think about this question, well, what does it mean to be Catholic? I want to try to explain it in this way. First of all, in terms of the commonalities, and this is important. So I'm saying that Catholic is a way of being human. The way of being human, in which one has great respect for persons, for the dignity of individuals, that it puts us on the same basis with people we often call humanists. A lot of times we tend to separate out Catholic and humanists. I was at another university, Bowling Green, at one time. They used to have a course where they would ask students to spend about a number of weeks with a humanist and try to get some feel for what was going on with them. And it always delighted me if a good number of students called me up and said, well, would you be my humanist for the next 3 weeks? Because I would see common cause with the people dedicated to improving the human condition, the humanists. So you take people like Albert Camus, who would call himself an atheist, or John Paul Sartre. We could take the world of psychology and so on, the important figures there like Abraham Maslow or Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologists, and say, yes, we have common cause with them. So Catholic, as I'm seeing it, first of all, is a way of being human. Links us even with philosophers like William James or John Dewey. Secondly, being Catholic is a way of being religious. To be religious, in the vocabulary in this class, means that one has a feeling for myth and symbol, for ritual. That one understands there is a mystery dimension to life. This gives us common ground with people like Buddhists, for example. I had a marvelous dialogue with a Buddhist last August in Kyoto, Japan. And go up on this tabletop, this Mount Hiei. And up there I find this Buddhist and arranged dialogue. And this man, if I asked him about belief in God, he says, it's probably feet yet there. I see him right there. If I ask this man, does he believe in God, he doesn't really understand the question. He's blank. And yet, we have a lot of common ground, and we talk a lot about what I'll call the religious dimension of life. We talk about meditation, prayer forms, and so on. And so we have common cause, again, with people like that, who I'm calling religious, even though they would not specifically believe in God. A lot of us know the work of Joseph Campbell, the one who's done all the work on myth and symbol. Have a lot of linkages with somebody like that. Thirdly, being Catholic is a way of being theistic, of being a theist. You know, this links us with the great monotheistic religions like Judaism and Islam, and with all Christian people. So if on the exam we say what links, next quiz Thursday, what links Christians, Muslims, and Jews, the answer is monotheism. That's belief in the one God. And then finally, being Catholic is a way of being Christian. To be Christian means that one accepts Jesus Christ as the final prophet, as the definitive prophet, as my dialogue with Muslims would move me to say it. Since Muhammad, the great prophet, comes chronologically after Jesus. So Islamic community would be happier if we talked about Jesus as, from our viewpoint, as the definitive prophet and not the final one. So the word final doesn't mean chronological, but it means the sense that the final message is found in Jesus Christ, that he is the Savior. And so this notion of Christianity links us, therefore, with mainline Protestants, with evangelicals, with Lutherans, with Anglicans, with Eastern Orthodox Christians. Now, it seems important to me to start this whole course with that in mind. They were studying Catholic thought. And the value of understanding that is that we now set up dialogue. We don't set up an exclusive, unique kind of self-understanding of Catholicism that screens everybody else out. What it sets up is the possibility of increasing dialogue with other groups, because, not on the basis of convenience, but on the basis of shared humanity, or a shared religious outlook, or a shared theistic belief. So, it sets up the need for cooperation, for collaboration, I think, on a solid basis. So when we're doing Catholic thought, it is not a matter of saying it is something totally unique in the sense that it doesn't connect in with anything else. Quite the contrary, we find all of this common ground. Now we move to the question of what it is that might be distinctive about Catholicism. There's an interesting analogy that McBrien uses in his book to explain how one would get at this. He talks about the United States flag. You know, when we say the United States flag is unique, or how would we understand the relationship to other flags? Well, first of all, other countries got flags, so that puts us together. Other countries got flags with red, white, and blue on them. There's other countries that have similar flags and so on. But when you configure it in a certain way, with a certain number of stripes and a field of stars, there's no denying when you look at it, that's an American flag. The same sort of thing, I think, goes for our approach to Catholic thought. There's all of the elements can be found elsewhere, almost all of them, but when you configure them in a certain way, it now takes a distinctive shape so that one can notice it or see it, identify it. And that's part of the burden of what I want to do now after seeing the commonalities, to see the distinctive trends going on today and to suggest that it is a distinctive configuration, distinctive flag, using that analogy that comes out. Now, our handout here should be of assistance to you, and as we go through these, it suggests the next 10 points that I'm dealing with. That is, greater awareness of pluralism and so on. I'm going to spend more time on the first ones, and with the sense that those become more important, and then we will go on from there. So if you're trying to follow me in the lecture, I'm now going through these next 10 points, and to see how we might understand them. Now, so the first point that I think is true about current trends in Catholic thought and is extremely significant is that we are now becoming more and more aware of pluralism within Catholic thought, within the Catholic community as a whole. So that means that we find diverse worldviews, mindsets, theologies, philosophies, spiritualities, diverse ways of trying to be Catholic, and therefore diverse ways of trying to understand that, the work of Catholic thought. There was a time when we sort of thought of this whole business of being that it's sort of monolithic, the Catholic Church. For many of us, there was a reawakening to the idea of pluralism at the time of the Second Vatican Council, which is before the first, with many people in here, is an historical event, and an event that some other people really lived through. But during that council, we learned by reading the newspapers, many of the people in the Catholic community for the first time, about pluralism. Up to that time, almost everybody thought, well, everybody in the Catholic world thinks the same. There's one body of Catholic thought. I remember writing a very clever article while I was in the seminary, definitively proving that nothing would happen at the Second Vatican Council. Mostly because of this monolithic outlook. And there were, what we found out was, through newspaper reports from many of us, well, there's different viewpoints. There's like conservatives there, and liberals. And then they began to raise up sort of representative figures that symbolize these diverse trends. And they'd even build on things. Then there was the famous Cardinal Ottaviani. You don't need to remember this for the exam, but Cardinal Ottaviani was sort of a defender of the conservative cause, very traditionalist, even reactionary. There was a story that went around that said that Cardinal Ottaviani during the council, he got into a cab and he said, "Take me to the council." And the cab driver drove him to Trent. Now, one of the questions on the quiz could well be, why do some people laugh at this? That would be a good quiz question so if you don't know why people laugh, then one could ask, I suppose, or read or something, investigate that. So, but what we saw for many of us is that for the first time this pluralism. So as we began to think about it, as the theologians told us, they said, well, this is not unusual. You know, really, there's been pluralism since the beginning. Go back to the New Testament and you got 4 gospels. Got different ways of saying who Jesus is, how they understood him. You know, you had in Corinth factions, following different groups, people not getting along. You had Paul was standing Peter to his face at a council of Jerusalem in 49 with different viewpoints about how you let people in. Do male converts from the Greek world have to be circumcised or not? There's a major question in order to become Christians. And you have 2 different viewpoints on that. So right away in the New Testament we see this pluralism. A second way that we see pluralism right away is between East and West. Right from the beginning, Christianity developed in 2 different strains. An Eastern style that we would find in cities like Alexandria and Antioch and Jerusalem, and a Western style centered in Rome. And from the very beginning, they began to diverge. And finally, they were kept going their separate ways, changed politically, economically, and then in 1056, that became sort of a definitive split between East and West, which gave us the world of Christian orthodoxy on the one hand, and the world of Western Christianity on the other. And so, again, 2 ways of looking at things. Now, we often don't have a feel for that. The one analogy that's been used is this, that we in the Christian West have been breathing through one lung ever since 1056. We've been thinking only in terms of our own Western ways of understanding things. And therefore, we're not fully alive. And then we become to see that only as we would move into breathing with the other lung. I was in Moscow in April of 1990 giving some lectures there, and I had a wonderful opportunity to encounter some of these Russian Orthodox, this Eastern lung, this other lung in the Christian body. And I remember there was this wonderful young lady who took me to the monastery of St. Sergius, where you saw all these wonderful churches and these icons and all these people around and lighting candles, and the priest saying these prayers out loud. And it was sort of a chaotic scene, and the artwork all over the place. And at one point, she said to me, Irene, this young lady, she said, she was a convert to Orthodoxy and in her 20s, and suddenly had a conversion. The Soviet life is so empty to her. She's going to find something meaning, and she found an Orthodox Christianity. She's excited, wants to talk about it. And she says to me, why are your Catholic churches so bad? Now, I don't know if you can put yourself in my shoes. Some people can, but I've lived my whole life hearing the question from the Protestant part of the United States saying, why are your churches so cluttered? Well, why are your rituals so complex? You've lost the simplicity of it all. And here, I'm hearing something totally different. Why are your churches so bare? That's what we call culture shock. But what it represents is this notion that indeed there is a whole other way of living out this Christian faith. There's pluralism that's existed from the very beginning in the first 1,000 years. That was sort of a vital kind of synergism created between East and West, something that we would need to recover. What happened in the Catholic community with all that diversity at the time of the Protestant Reformation, another great event, so we got our little bit of this history that's got a little bit, 1056 split between East and West, and 16th century split between the Protestant communities and the Roman Catholic communities. And part of the work of the Reformers, great Reformers, Luther and Calvin, great theologians with marvelous insights into what the Scriptures were all about, important things that we in the Catholic world still try to learn, some of which we caught up with at the Second Vatican Council. And the Catholic response to that in the 16th century was known as the Counter-Reformation, centered on the Council of Trent, a word you all have heard, right? You might even get the joke after a while. Council of Trent was the reaction of the Catholic community to the Protestant Reformation. And part of what it tried to do was to get back greater uniformity into the church, to get a greater centralization in Rome, to get all of that in order and straightened out. That reached its high point in Vatican I in 1870. First Vatican Council was proclaimed the doctrine of papal infallibility. It was all part of a centralizing process. Now what happened, of course, is that we people reading the newspapers in the 1960s, at the start of the council, were products of that. That whole long effort to get uniformity, to centralize, to get it together, has taken such hold and so strong in our minds that we were shocked by the pluralism. Shocked to hear there were different ways of being Catholic or thinking about Catholicism. But it took us back to say, now the history would show us that it's the more recent that has been less authentic in terms of the original pluralism we find in the New Testament and in the early church. That sense of a monolithic church is intensified in the United States, mostly because the Catholics who came here in tremendous waves of immigration from 1820 through 1920, millions and millions from Eastern Europe, from Ireland, from Germany, came into what is largely a Calvinistic country, shaped by the Protestant thought of John Calvin. And so very often the Catholics had trouble fitting in, knowing how they were to fit in, often accused of being unpatriotic. There was a prejudice known and still known as nativism. Nativism was the prejudice that said the Catholics were to be kept outside. Famous signs, Irish need not apply. All kind of stereotypes used. The Catholics were dirty, had too many kids, lived in the big cities, drank too much, etc. It all sounds slightly familiar to our world today as we think of new immigrant groups and so on. What it produced, though, in the Catholic world was even a greater sense of uniformity, of gather together, of hold it in place, let's make sure we're all united here. And so we don't want to talk about our differences so much, because we got to have solidarity to be able to live effectively in this dominantly Protestant country of ours. Now, what we have as a result of the Second Vatican Council is a greater sense of this pluralism. And now the characteristic statement that I would like to make is, in the Catholic world, we have to learn how to celebrate that pluralism and not just tolerate it. That's the mood that goes with the word for me. We want to celebrate it, be pleased with it, be happy that there are people who live it out in different ways. There are different mindsets, theologies, philosophies, piety, spirituality, different ways of understanding what the Catholic world is all about. What we want to do is part of that is to begin to make sense out. What we want to do is not reduce the pluralism to uniformity, but characteristic phrase from John Courtney Murray, great Catholic theologian, most important Catholic theologian that the United States has produced, died in 1967, John Courtney Murray, good name, one of the names to remember for certain purposes. I almost forgot what I was going to say. After a long parenthetical statement. What I was going to say is that Murray told us, don't try to reduce pluralism to uniformity, but try to reduce it to intelligibility. That is, try to understand it, try to get hold on it, try to sort it out in one way or another. And that's exactly what is going on these days in Catholic thought. You look at this bewildering array and how do you understand it? Well, one way of understanding it is in terms of groups that one would see within the Catholic community. One would see conservatives who are interested in keeping the tradition alive. One would see reactionaries, often associated with the magazine The Wanderer, who want to turn the clock back, who are against almost everything that's happened since the Council. Then we would find liberals. Those are the kind of people who want more change, more adaptation. And then we would find within the grouping charismatic Catholics, people who like to fill with the Spirit and pray with their arms up. People in the Pentecostal tradition would recognize that. Very akin to the Protestant Pentecostal world. Gifts of the Spirit. So we would see that. It's sort of so you begin to sort it out a little bit. Yeah, there's these reactionaries there, far right, and there's conservatives, and there's the moderates like Avery Dulles, who will be one of our lecturers here. And then we find people like that are more liberal, like Richard McBride, who will be lecturing here. So we find different ways of trying to live out this Catholic faith. Another way of distinguishing out, given to us by Eugene Kennedy, name not important there, distinction is, that is, between Catholics who are sort of bound into the institution. He calls them Culture One Catholics. Again, the term isn't important. But the Culture One Catholics take it all seriously, and they care what the Pope says, what the bishops say, what's going on in the church. They read magazines and so on. And the Culture Two Catholics, who still call themselves that, but they don't care about it. I mean, if the Pope says something, it doesn't not a big deal to them. If the bishop says something, they happen to agree, fine. If not, they don't get angry or upset about it. They just sort of leave it go. So, there we would find another distinction that would maybe help us sort that out. Here's another one that comes from Andrew Greeley, who some people know as a writer of novels and writes also fine sociology of religion. And we're going to use this thought in another section also. But he has identified the phenomenon of selective Catholics. That is, they are people who select out from the big body of Catholic thought and practice the things they like or help. They use them, appropriate them, and the rest of it they just leave go. Now, what I think is important about selective Catholicism is to remember that everybody's a selective Catholic from one viewpoint, even the Pope. That is, that everybody has elements of the tradition that make sense, that help one, that one uses to get up on Monday morning or to deal with the death of a loved one, while whole big parts of the rest of it simply don't make much difference. One does not, as we would say, existentially appropriate it, make it one's own in a personal sense. It's just there. So some Catholics can say the creed over and over, he descended into hell, and that would never mean anything to someone. If Christ descended into hell, it just doesn't help with anything. So all Catholics, in that sense, are selective. The derogatory term used in this regard is cafeteria Catholics. That is, they go into the cafeteria and just select what they want and leave the rest of it. But I like to see it in a more positive way and not use the derogatory term, because I think that selection is something we all do. Some people like Luke's gospel and some like Matthew. Some are fans of Carl Reiner, my mentor, and other people like Hans Urs von Balthasar, which I suppose is a favorite of most people here in the theological world. So, that is an attempt, one, to celebrate. So, here's the idea, the main ideas I see. One is, there's a current trend in Catholic thought to celebrate pluralism, and two, to reduce it to intelligibility. So we can begin to sort it out. I mean, it's hard to see. It says, like, as James Joyce said, to be Catholic means here comes everybody. Here comes everybody. Or Charles Kern likes to say, it's a big church. It's a big church. And so it becomes harder to figure out exactly what it is in terms of holding it together. And that leads us to the second major point. That is, I'll tell you what I'm going to do at this point. I'm going to ask people to do a one-to-one discussion. I do this periodically. I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and just see if you can talk about what you've gotten out of it so far. It's a good chance to catch up on your notes, get your head straight. It's also a chance for people sitting on floors who are uncomfortable to identify chairs that they can sit down. I see some empty spots down here. So we're inviting a one-to-one discussion, and if people are next to a chair that's open, raise your hand and people will come and sit in those. Incidentally, what we're going to do on the Tuesday lectures, the time goes straight to 12 to 1:40, and we stay in the room till 1:40. The lectures have various options about whether they have questions or how they want to go about that, but there won't be any formal breaks in between. Go to 1:40. Also, there are, obviously, people sitting there listening for a long time. There are opportunities for discussion. There is a group meeting in room 1016, I think it is, afterwards. It says it on the syllabus. And it's down this hallway out here. So people who want to come to that group are welcome to, and I know there's other groups around who are here and going to meet afterwards and continue the discussion, which is obviously an important part of all this. So the interaction in this large group setting is going to be reduced, limited. Undergraduates will get their chance on Thursday, and other groups can meet at various times so they can kick the ideas around a bit. Now, I want to move to the second point in the listing of 10, which is the search for unity. As soon as you got that much diversity, then you got to ask yourself, well, what holds Catholic thought together? What is it that we have in common? What are the essentials that we can hang on to and say this is what Catholicism is, or this is what Catholic thought centers on, and so on. Now, this quest has been going on throughout the 19th and 20th century. The Protestant world has been very interested in this question of trying to define Catholicism. Very often it has been defined in terms of its centralized authority, its great emphasis on sacraments, the hierarchical authority that is exercised, and so on. One of the most important Protestant theologians of the 20th century, Paul Tillich, died in 1965, Tillich talked about the distinction, talked about the Catholic substance and the Protestant principle of criticism. And he said if you look at the two groups, Tillich, as I say, is a Lutheran, that was his denominational background. Great German theologian, came to the United States, taught at Union Theological and at Harvard, University of Chicago, and so on. Tremendous thinker and synthesizer. Anyway, Tillich says that there's a Catholic substance. The Catholics are good at keeping the big tradition together, of keeping all of the various strains, all the pluralism from the past, not losing it, the substance as he calls it. But what Catholics aren't so good at, he said, is criticizing that, of seeing the accretions, of seeing the way it gets out of hand, of seeing the ways in which throughout the history gets away from the pure lines of the Scripture. So that becomes, one way of thinking about this. That there's a Catholic substance, and its problem is largely to do with its inability to criticize, to critique in the light of the Scriptures, according to the norm provided by the Bible. To take up another Protestant theologian who looks at our own situation today, that's Langdon Gilkey, Baptist theologian. Gilkey sees these characteristics: a sense of tradition and history. When he's looking at it, sense of tradition and history, a sense of community. Catholics are big on gathering the folks, community. A sacramental incarnational sense. That means that God is found in and through this world. And finally, the importance of reason and philosophy. I guess I'll comment on that later on. So it's interesting always for any group to see how the outsiders see us. How people who are interested in the tradition. So he said that sense of tradition, sense of community, sense of symbol, and finally the drive towards reason. To figure things out and use philosophy constructively. Now, Avery Dulles, one of our lecturers, has written a lot on this, and now to move with inside Catholic self-understanding and how he would see it. He stresses the idea that Catholicism is open to the achievements of every race and culture. There's no real reason why you can't have Ethiopian Catholics. I got a kick out of Mass Sunday before somebody, an Ethiopian graduate student came up to me and gave me an Ethiopian cross, and beautifully mounted and so on. It gets enculturated around the world. There's no inherent reason it can't do that. And then he goes to the idea of the Catholic both and. This is a common phrase to see. You'll see it in the Grimes text. It'd be good to try to figure out what that means. Both and as opposed to either or. That is, that the Catholic sense is very often there's two things that we have to keep. We don't want to lose either one, and our real problem is to keep them both together. It's like our Lutheran friends might say they have both word and sacrament. They want to keep them both, word and sacrament, and they don't want anybody to take either side away or play it down. They're going to keep that in some sort of fruitful tension. So there is a Catholic both and, with so many things, both nature and grace, both reason and faith, both scripture and tradition. Now, to properly understand what it means to say both scripture and tradition or with any of those things, however, you would say it does not mean that there's like a separate source. The Catholic just sort of, in an unsophisticated way, puts the two together, like, yeah, God speaks us through the Bible, but he also speaks through this other co-equal source tradition. The both ands are more sophisticated than that in the Catholic heritage. What it means somehow is, in the ongoing tradition of the Church, the Scriptures play a normative role. But we always remember that the Church produced the Scriptures in the first place and continues to interpret them. That's a more sophisticated way to understand both and, not just two things sitting side by side, same way with reason and faith. I recognize that being a little murky philosophically. If some people read the book, textbook, the assigned material for Thursday, which will be part of the quiz, you will see some of that, I think, worked out in a little better detail. Now, the author of our textbook, who will be one of the people here, one of our lecturers, has spent a lot of time trying to figure out all of this. And I think that we see an example of this in the third page of the handout that we're following now. So on one page we saw those theologians' names like Origen, Augustine, and we turn the page and we see an attempt to say what is distinctive about Catholic identity. And I start with capital letter C, an appreciation of the peacetime office. What that means fundamentally is a Catholic sense that it's good to have some spokesman for the Christian community, somebody who holds it together. And we traditionally give that role to the Bishop of Rome. Appreciation, that's a good office. Now, Catholics will differ on saying, well, should he live in Rome or not, or should he dress in a certain way, or disagree with what he says. But there's a dominant Catholic sense that rather than have total fragmentation, it's good to hold it together in some way. And one way to do that is through the successor of Peter, the one who played a special role in holding the 12 together within the New Testament period. So that's one distinctive thing that they find, and others will there too. Next is the Catholic respects the tradition. So that means that the whole history is part of what we are. We have to put up with it. So we're the people who have to face the fact that we had inquisitions and crusades and blights upon the history of Christianity. We can't just evade that because we also want to claim the good things that happened throughout history. The ways that the Church functioned as a civilizing influence within the Roman Empire, for example. So the whole history is our burden, and we'd like to be able to draw on all of that. Whether it's the great theologians like Augustine and Aquinas and so on. So for us, it's never a matter of saying, well, the whole history starts up in the 16th century, or only listen to authors from that time on, or after the 11th century. The whole history becomes important to us. Next is Catholics have an incarnational sacramental sense of life. Well, this becomes, I think, very crucial and part of the key. And what that means is there's a Catholic way of seeing that God is found in matter, in this material world. That if we're ever going to encounter God, it's in and through this real world of ours. So that the whole world is sacramental. The whole world is a sign, in other words, the synonym in the sense of sacramental, a sign of the presence of God. It's not a totally transparent sign. You don't see it all clearly, but there's clues in the real world that God is present. So you get a Catholic sense that the world has a fundamental goodness about it, that it's great. Well, that's why Catholics have never seen a need to have strictures on dancing or gambling. It is always in a sense that the things of life have a goodness about it. One is to enjoy them. There's that line of Belloc, I never get it exactly right, the word of the Catholic sun does shine, there is merriment and good wine. Not exact quote there, but anyway, there is that Catholic sense, and I often say these days not to be used glibly when we consider all of the problems of alcoholism and so on, but it does represent the sense that the world is great, God appears in and through it as a fundamental goodness. And so there is, and we see that in terms of the seven sacraments themselves, as the Church receives seven special rites, like baptism, confirmation, for a long time, and is not expecting to hear anything this week. So the sacramental sense has a downside to it. I would say, fortunately, what happens in the Catholic community now is we get a revival of interest in the Word and Scripture, and we'll see that when Don Senior's here, and more interest in Bible study, and more urging of people to read the Scriptures on their own, and so on. So we sort of catch up with that Protestant insight. Then we have the next one here. It says, engenders a fundamentally positive attitude towards human nature and the world. I think maybe we've seen this played out in that sacramental sense. It sort of clearly goes together with that idea. All right, let me move on to the next one then about reason and faith. Say something about that. Traditionally, in the Catholic community, we have treasured philosophy and reason. The idea has always been that reason can help bring us to the brink of faith, that reason can help us understand the faith we have, that it can give us the tools to pass it on to the next generation. So historically, the great theologian Origen in the East made use of Neoplatonic thought, as did Augustine in the West. Our classic example of this would be a good one to remember, our undergraduates, the classic example of this is Thomas Aquinas, who died in 1274. I often try to remember the dates of theologians when they died. Augustine died in 1230. Aquinas died in 1274. And Aquinas was faced with a problem because the Muslim world, which is important to remember, kept alive the thought of Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher from before the time of Christ. Now that thought from the Islamic world began coming into the West in the time of Aquinas and shortly before that. The question was, what would you do with it? Many church authorities, including the Archbishop of Paris, where Aquinas taught, said, this is dangerous stuff. Don't play with this philosophy. It'll mess you up. But Aquinas, great genius that he was and synthesizer, said, no, it's not dangerous. What we want to do is listen to it, enter into dialogue with it. I want to use it as part of my overarching synthesis. And so Aquinas was able to produce this marvelous synthesis of faith and reason, where he incorporated the philosophy of Aristotle in one of the great achievements in Catholic thought, which becomes a model ever since for how we think it ought to be done. And thinkers in the 20th century have tried to do. My own mentor, Karl Rahner, who is a great German Jesuit, who David Tracy called one of the 4 or 5 most influential Catholic theologians in all of history. Rahner, I maybe will get to say more about him as we go along, was interested in dialogue with existential thought. There's thought from Jean Paul Sartre in his writings, of Martin Heidegger, people who ostensibly were atheistic or agnostic, and Rahner didn't fear that. In fact, he used to go to Heidegger's seminars at the University of Freiburg and learn from this great philosopher. And so many of his ideas are worked into his thought. A 20th century example of the same thing. We don't need to fear it. This sort of distinguishes us very often from the dominant Protestant mode of thinking of philosophy. That would be best represented by the 20th century theologian, you could say the most influential of all theologians of the 20th century, Karl Barth. That's B-A-R-T-H, Karl Barth, one of the giants and the most important. But for Barth, at least in his early writings, said philosophy, that's not going to help you at all. All this other pagan wisdom. That's what you got to do is get the Bible, get the Word, get the witness. Jesus Christ is the Word. Get the witness to Christ that's in the Bible. That's what you have to center on. You don't need this philosophy. You don't need this reason and thinking about it to get in touch with the Word. And we see that in our own culture today. In the United States, on campus, same sort of outlook. Those who want to use reason, philosophy, and those who are more interested in an uninterpreted scriptural word. I must hasten to add that Karl Barth was in no sense a fundamentalist, always denied that. But he also did not have much use for the world of philosophy in doing theological work. And the next one, Catholicism understands as a universal religion, open to different things and so on. Appreciation of the role of Mary and the saints, that might require more comment and so on. So those are characteristics that one will find played out in McBrien's book, borrowed from him and from other thinkers, Monica Hellwig and so on, and sort of put together in this form. Incidentally, there's no reference. This material here that you're looking at are background notes to a videotape series that I have. That's is part of the study guide, and we'll be using these periodically as short memory tags for what we have to say here. You can go back over it and grab hold of it once more. Now, I move to still another way of saying what's this unity? What's distinctive in the midst of all this pluralism? Now I'm borrowing from Andrew Greeley. Andrew Greeley, in his book, The Catholic Myth. I don't think you see the reference here. I'm on the same sheet, I'm sorry. I'm down to, what is it there? J, the Catholic Imagination. So Greeley says he does empirical research, that is, he gives people surveys and questionnaires and so on, and tries to figure out what makes them tick religiously. And he has identified what we're calling a Catholic imagination, which you could play off against a Jewish imagination or Islamic imagination and so on. Every distinctive religious group would have dominant symbols, dominant sensibilities, dominant images of the way they perceive the world and what it's really all about. So Greeley tries to say, what is this Catholic imagination all about? Now, you see, first of all, a word he borrows from David Tracy. His name I often use as he's one of our brightest theologians today. Anyway, the Catholic imagination is analogical, which means something like I've been describing sacramental. That is, it's an attempt to see God's presence in and through the created world. Next thing that he thinks is true about Catholic sense is that we see society in a distinctive way. For us, society is not a bad thing. Society is a God-given reality. It's something we're born into. And we have to figure out really how to live in that society and somehow make it better. That becomes the Catholic test. I think in a sense John F. Kennedy portrayed this Catholic sensibility. Kennedy was not afraid of power or the use of power. He was not afraid of the political process. He saw all of that as fundamentally good, that was the role of the citizen. And out of his Catholic sense, to be part of all of that, to be immersed in that world. Then we see the notion that the Catholic ethic or behavior system, the way we think we ought to live, has a more communal element than we would see in Protestant individualism. And so there, much of what we do and say seems to have the role of protecting the community, protecting the total human community. I think this is part of our stand on abortion. that our sense is that the human community can't exclude anybody, and somebody's got to speak for the most defenseless and the weakest elements within that community. Otherwise, the whole larger body will not function as it ought to. I'm not going to go through, I think, all of these other elements. I'm going to skip down to number 9. And that is the image of God, which becomes absolutely crucial. And here it really believes that there is a sort of fundamental reservoir of positive imagery within the Catholic sensibility. That we tend to be able to talk about God in a loving way. That we see somehow that God is benign, that the mystery that surrounds us is friendly, that you could call that God friend and spouse and mother and all of those kinds of images. Again, he plays that off with another sensibility that he sees within the Protestant world. That, I remind you, is based on empirical research. What I think is valuable about it is the emphasis on imagination. I've become more and more convinced that the images structure the way we see the world. If one has a heavy moralistic image of God, we're almost sure to have a poor self-image. In fact, my teacher, Carl Rahner, said they go together exactly. So that if someone would tell me enough about their image of God, I would know an awful lot about them. Self-image, how much self-esteem, how much self-confidence, what maturity level, etc. But the two go exactly together in Rahner's mind. And when people are trying to improve themselves or make progress, or when people are trying to do therapy and so on, it seems vitally important to work on both things, the self-image and the image of God. Those two things are tightly woven. In fact, really suggests that the greatest predictor of good positive behavior in life, whether it means being regular churchgoer or working on social justice or being sexually adjusted in life, forming good relationships, the single best predictory thing isn't how many years you went to particular religious school or what doctrines you hold. It's whether your imagination is structured by warm and positive, comforting images of God and Christ. Greatest predictor in his mind of positive behavior. So I believe it's good to remember that sense of image here. All right, that is an attempt to look at the second point about the search for unity. Let me just stop there and see if anybody has any questions they want to ask. I'm going to limit questions, obviously, and whenever we open it up, it's time for clarifying questions. That's when our other professors are here, too, that we will have for clarifying questions and not for speeches from the audience. So, we're collected $500,000 to be able to have them come here and listen to them and not hear speeches from other people. The discussion can occur afterwards in the various settings, especially Thursday. So are there any questions about these first points I've made? Yes?
In the outline, it suggests under the Catholic respect for tradition, it says Catholics do not hold that there is a second source of revelation tradition.
Yeah.
It seems to contradict something. Clarify that.
Question is asked on the note that says something that Catholics do not hold that tradition is a separate source of revelation. And I guess it's a point I tried to make before from another angle and can elaborate on. That the fight at the time of the Protestant Reformation was something like this. The Reformers said, look, we got all these traditions that have developed that are outside the Bible, and say some go against the Bible. So we must set up, as they said, sola scriptura, two Latin words, which means the scriptures alone, only scripture. And that became the rallying point for the Reformation. That's what's wrong. Then you could look and see all these things that the church is doing in the light of the scripture alone and say it's out of whack, it's wrong, get rid of it. That became the Protestant critiquing principle. The Catholic reaction at the time of the Council of Trent was to move in another direction and say, no, that isn't right. There's two sources of revelation. There's scripture and tradition, and that became the common way of saying it. all the way down to the time of the Second Vatican Council. In fact, when they wrote the preparatory documents for the Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 65, Catholic bishops all over the world gathered, Second Vatican, got to remember that one. Documents ahead of time they're preparing, and the document on Revelation was entitled, it was like a red flag in front of the Protestant observers who were at the council, Two Sources of Revelation. Well, the great genius of Pope John the 23rd was to see the problem and to figure out a solution. Because he needed a two-thirds vote to get rid of that document, and he couldn't get the two-thirds vote, so he did what good administrators do. He got another committee together, which included my mentor, Paul Ronner, and said, straighten this out, write another document. And so they wrote another document which says there's not two sources of revelation, there's one source of revelation, that's God. And God's revelation comes to us through Jesus Christ. It's a simple solution they came up with, but it undercut a fight of over 400 years. So good solutions, I guess, always sound simple. After one source, that's God speaking through Christ. Now that message entrusted to Christ and preached by Christ is carried on within the community. The community keeps the memory of Jesus alive. And that community, early Christian community, keeping the memory of Jesus alive, began to write some of it down. Letters of Paul. Around 70, in the 80s, 90s, writing Gospels, 4 of them. That becomes sort of the verbal precipitate, as I call it, of this ongoing tradition. But the community not only produces it out of its tradition, out of its handing on of the message, out of its ongoing life, which is what tradition means in this sense, but it also continues to read it, to interpret it, and to keep it alive for people throughout the year. So that's the more sophisticated way I would say that tradition and Scripture work together to go along. Well, I hope that helps. If not, you maybe read a little bit more about that. Let me move to the third point here, and which is the distinction between the classical and the contemporary mindset. Now, you will get some help on this in the notes if you go back to the second page of this note, the notes that we've been looking at. The one that started out capital A, value and importance of theology, and at the bottom you see E, the distinction between classical and contemporary theology. Now my statement would be that there is a growing shift from a classical understanding of reality of life to a contemporary one. And I would have to understand what that means. The notes that the definitions of classical and contemporary there will be helpful to us as a summary point. But let me try to give it to you this way. The classical way of understanding the world is as a fixed system, which human beings look at from one perspective and try to make sense out of it because it's ordered and fixed and intelligible. And therefore one can find truth there. And one finds the truth, and it's timeless. If it was true back in the Council of Trent in the 16th century, it's true now. Now what has happened is, in the 19th and 20th centuries, we have begun to see the world in different ways. The mindset has changed. The fundamental worldview has changed. It's been changed by one major factor, that is the discovery of evolution. So that, as a great Catholic thinker, Teilhard de Chardin, said, evolution is not just a theory of how we evolved as a species, but evolution is a light within which we look at all of reality. So that people begin to see the world as changing, evolving, in flux, in process. And not only that, but people begin to see that you can see something from different perspectives and it will look different. And all disciplines have seen this. Cubist painters figured that out. That on one canvas you could paint something from different perspectives. So you get early Picasso showing us that. You can paint it on one canvas, depending on how you look at it. We've seen it in the world of science where they tell us, well, you analyze light, and from one perspective it's a wave, and from another perspective it is a particle. And you can't really figure out which one it really is. There's different perspectives. So we see it in all the disciplines, different ways of seeing things. What we've discovered in the modern times is a more historical way of viewing it. Now, Teilhard de Chardin died in 1955, great Jesuit visionary who wrote about all this stuff, divine milieu, phenomenon of man, and so on. Teilhard had a wonderful image for this. He said, people before the 19th century, before the time of Darwin, discovery of evolution, were white people down below decks of the ship. And they're down there moving about, having a good time, a little partying now and then, a little bit of shuffleboard, a little bit of conversation, so on. Life goes on. But then, in the 19th century, some of those people below decks came up onto the top deck. And when they got up there, they said, my heavens, the whole thing is moving. And now we got a new set of questions. Where are we going? Does this process have any meaning to it? And so people began to cluster on the top decks. People who had moved to what we're calling here a contemporary mindset. They began to say, yeah, the world is flux and flow. The world is in process. There's different perspectives. And they said, truth is historically conditioned. You can't just repeat what the Council of Chalcedon said in 451 about Jesus, one divine person with two natures. You've got to know why they said that. What did the words mean? What were the arguments on each side? All of the thinkers we have coming to lecture in this series understand that truth is historically conditioned by culture, and it's even personally conditioned, because it looks different depending on our background, our viewpoint, our history, our temperament, personality, previous study, etc. That's the shift that has been occurring and continues to occur. We have a conflict going now within the Catholic community between classicists, people who see the world in that strict kind of way in which morality is black and white, and if the Vatican says something, it is true. And people who say, no, you have to think it through. There's a lot of gray areas. It depends on how you define the terms. It depends on various factors. That shift is continuing because most young people today end up having, in one way or another, a contemporary mindset. It's hard to live in this world of changing images, of television, of diverse viewpoints, of pluralism, of democracy in the United States, and not have a fundamental sense of life as being evolving, as in process, changing, etc. One of the things you notice, however, is among young people, side by side with this, is very often a more classical understanding of religious reality, a traditional one. And I think this is what often creates conflict within young people as they begin to go to college, study different viewpoints. One of the clear results of going to college is to learn that there are opinions, and to learn that there are different ways of looking at something. Almost all people who go to college figure that out somewhere along the line. One of the good products that occur. But when that occurs, you then produce many crises of faith. That is, if the presentation of the religious system is classical, if it's cut and dried, if it's one perspective, if there's no sense of evolution to it, then one often says, what do I do with that? And the most dominant tendency at that point is to get rid of that classical religious system because it doesn't connect in with one's gut. Because it doesn't make sense in terms of what one now has come intuitively to think is true about life. That is, that we're on the top deck, on a ship and it's moving, and you have a new set of questions. Now, one of the things that I have found out is that in the Catholic community, one has to find ways to talk so that people with a classical mindset and contemporary mindset can get together. And I have sort of a vignette that brings that out to me. There was one gentleman who used to write bad things about me and complain about me as too liberal a Catholic theologian. And he was rather strident in his criticism. I would get copies of these things. They'd be sent to the media and the bishop and so on. Well, one day I suggested to him that we get together for lunch. I didn't really know him. I called him up and said, well, maybe we could talk about this. Not too happy, so he reluctantly agreed to that. I said, well, I'm going to send you a copy of one of my little books, a Gracious Mystery book. You might want to read it before we talk, and so on. Well, I got there to lunch, and we sat down waiting for the barrage, for the attack, and the guy says to me, I like some of that stuff you write about your father. I said, oh, yeah? Yeah, I said, I had a relationship with my father, a lot like that. He goes on, and we're talking like this for about 45 minutes. All about deeper relationships, sensibilities about life, dealing with the death of loved ones, heavy stuff. And after that time, I said to him, well, what about all this stuff that, you've been all upset with the stuff I write and teach and so on? It's not that important. Well, there's an important understanding there, and that is when you look at the classical and contemporary mindset as they're at work, there is a way in which one can still enter into dialogue and conversation. If one can deal with one's primary intuitions of life, of one's deepest kinds of experiences, of questions of love and freedom and what we treasure and value, it seems possible to undercut even these tremendously diverse mindsets, because at another level, one simply isn't going to get it together. One's going to argue forever about these things. I suggested as a student one time couldn't talk to her parents when she went home. They always fought, no matter what it was about. Whether it was a matter of going to Mass on Sunday or what they thought of priests or nuns, or it didn't matter what the question was, it was always a fight. And I suggested the same thing. How about talking about some deeper level concern that you both have? And they found that indeed they could talk about that. So it suggests that the mindsets are not the last word. There is another way to perhaps try to sort some of this out. So I said I was going to take dominant time on all of those, the first three, and indeed I have been faithful to that promise. I do want to try to say some things about the other elements in the current trends as I would see them, trying to pick and choose a bit. A few words about the next one. It has to do with the increased sense of trying, in one way or another, to see meaning in ordinary life. In daily kind of activities. The great model of this is my own teacher, Karl Rahner. I remember being with Rahner in Munich, and Rahner, this greatest theologian of the 20th century, probably one of the few in the whole history of the church, his brilliant mind and so on, was like an old shoe in the house where he lived. He was just down to earth and ordinary himself. It was often said when he went to a new city to lecture that he didn't want to see the cathedrals, he wanted to go to the department store. I remember at one gathering he was at, a friend of mine was there, told me his big concern was that everybody would have enough to drink and eat. I remember going on a walk with him one time where Rahner said we stopped at a little coffee house, and Rahner, it was like a old 60s style coffee house where they sang songs and sort of had a Christian message to it and so on. And his big interest was, well, how they prepared the food and how they took care of everybody there and so on. I once asked Ronner what his own greatest religious experience was, and he said, translated, immersion in the mystery. I said, oh, Father Ronner, you had a mystical experience of some kind. Never had one of those. I mean immersion in the mystery of ordinary life, of daily life. And so Ronner became the great apostle of trying to say that we should not get hung up on what I'll call the cult of the extraordinary, of looking all the time for some dominant message from God, some striking experience. And we got a lot of that these days. All throughout Christian history we've had this problem. The Gospel of Mark is predicated on that. That indeed there was too much sense that here was Jesus, the risen Savior, would work some miracles and straighten everything out for that early Christian community. Mark had to try to play that down. You had the Gnostics who said they got special insight into God that lifts them out of ordinary life. We have charismatics today very interested in these tremendous experiences, speaking in tongues and so on. We had all kind of interest in apparitions of Mary. But the counter movement, and I think the stronger movement, is this finding God in ordinary experience. Now he bases that on his old theology of grace that says that God is everywhere. God is present in all reality. He likes to say just because grace is free, gratuitous, does not mean it is rare. It's like the air we breathe, swim and move around in. So the writer says the big thing in life, the trick is to keep your eyes open, to watch what's happening, to not miss these signs of what's going on. Now relate this to the work of Abraham Maslow, who wrote about peak experiences. Some people know his thought. These highs when everything was together and integrated. And later on in his life, Maslow thought maybe he made a mistake. And he shouldn't have talked so much about peak experiences because he thought he set up a lot of the drug generation. People with drugs are going to get high. Everyone wants a quick high, quick fix. And so Maslow sort of repented of that. And he said, I want to talk more about plateau experience. More ordinary ones, where life is special and you see good things and so on. He used to do that himself, go to the ocean, same place every year. And in one way or another try to recreate for himself his own energy. So the plateau experience is like Warner's sense that really we need to get back to the ordinary. Thinking of the short story writer Catholic Flannery O'Connor, she had lupus in her 30s. She was sort of asked, do you want to go to Lourdes for a cure? Try to get a cure, a miracle. She was reluctant to go. That'd be like tempting God. She said, that's too extraordinary, too spectacular. Flannery O'Connor was much more inclined to simply try to live through her lupus, which killed her at the age 39, to go through it. She wasn't part of this cult of the extraordinary, but into the sort of unerring theology that I'm talking about. So I think there's sort of two movements around. You can look in the Catholic world, some people playing up these big things, other people more interested in the ordinary, daily life, family, work, and so on. Ronner writes these wonderful articles about finding God in going to sleep, in sitting down and standing up, in work, in play, in laughter, humor, all of the things that he thinks are the real catalyst for finding God. Next one has to do with greater emphasis on the laity in the church. Again, we've seen throughout the Catholic history sort of a tendency to clericalize, to play it up to the priests, and they're the most important ones. Vatican II, 1962 to 65, produced 16 documents. One of the great thrusts of Vatican II was emphasis on the role of the laity. And it's worked. It's amazing. It's one of the great trendsetters in history, I suppose. It actually worked. They got together and said, let's put more emphasis on the laity, and now we got lay ministry flourishing in the church like it probably never has in its whole history. In terms of educated, committed people involved in church life. It's quite a revolution that's gone on. still tensions and so on, but what we've recovered is the theology of baptism. Theology of baptism is what grounds us. It says all baptized people are responsible for the church, co-responsible, they have a mission, all have a vocation to married life or whatever, all to live it out in everyday existence. Something that was recovered again from the Protestant Reformation, where there was the great emphasis put on the laity. The sixth one says something about the importance of symbol and myth. I think I alluded to that in my talk about the role of imagination. I'll just put it this way, that in John's Gospel there is the temptation to take things Jesus says literally. So the woman at the well, he says, you got living water, and her response is, you don't have a bucket. Nicodemus, you are born again. How am I going to go back in my mother's womb? Tendency to take it literally. This is what we're seeing now in the current trend, is a much greater sense that all religious language is symbolic. It all points. If we say Jesus ascended into heaven, the right question is not how high. How high up did he go? That's a literal understanding. What we're learning more and more is that all religious language is symbolic. It points to a deeper level. It points to this mystery that's always surrounding. The great theologians knew that. Aquinas once said, the most important thing you can know about God is that we don't know him. That God's mysterious and no language can capture him or totally get a hold of him. That's something about the whole symbol and myth. Catholic thought, number 7, continued to expand the dialogue partners. Thomas Merton, a great example of this. Thomas Merton, in his early life, thought that Easter, he's a great monk, Trappist monk, 20th century figure, died tragically in Bangkok, electrocuted and so on, wrote 7-Story Mountain. Anyway, Thomas Merton, in his early life, said that the Eastern religions were bad, wouldn't have anything to do with them. And what did we find him late in his life? Making a pilgrimage to the great Buddhas in the Eastern world, these gigantic figures, and saying that he had some of his deepest religious experiences while encountering these gigantic Buddhas. That's what I mean by saying that the Catholic world continues to expand its dialogue partners, continues to be interested in learning from other people. So we learn out from Eastern religions, from Islam, from Judaism, from psychology, sociology, all these science itself. What is happening in the Catholic world, it keeps expanding. We want to learn from more people. Instead of saying Eastern religions are bad and pagan, we want to say that God, they're vehicles of truth and goodness, and we want to learn from them in one way or another. Implication of that is, if we want world peace, we got to have interreligious dialogue. Got to have interreligious dialogue. Got to learn to get along religiously if indeed we're going to make it. Number 8 has to do with us trying to work out a proper relationship between the church and the world. Michael Novak, when he's here, will have a lot to say about that, and I will give you some of my own notes on it before he comes to catch up with that particular question. I would say this, that the dominant sense is the Catholic community is shaped by the bishop's pastoral letters in the 1980s on the economy and on peace, in which they said, we live in this world, we're citizens of the United States, and we have to learn to interact with it. But we don't want to tell the culture what to do, and we won't just be reduced to a ghetto, like silence. We want to be a dialogue partner. So the answer to the question, what's the main model found in the bishop's pastoral letters on how we relate to church in the world is as a dialogue. We, the church, wants to be a dialogue partner, working with people of goodwill to say, how can we get more peace, more justice, create a better world? And then we have our last ones, the attempt to bring the feminist perspective into this. We're doing this in this course. We have Lisa Cahill, one of the best moral theologians in the United States, who will be talking, and Ann Carr, who writes on Christology. Our effort to bring the feminist perspective in, which is very important, growing effort along that line. Finally, the effort to relate Rome and the American church, and then maybe we'll say more about that as we go along. Reminders, undergraduate and graduate students, yes, remember there's a quiz Thursday. There's a one-page type paper they describe on your syllabus to turn in, and there is, you need to hand to Lori or to Pam one of us personally with your name printed on the paper and your signature that you were here. We'll meet Thursday in the same room for undergraduates, and next week we will hear Richard McCormick, one of the world's great moral theologians, address us on that topic. Thank you. You go ahead and write.
On the basic, I'm a graduate student. I just had one question to start the paper. Do we have to write our paper specifically on these topics, or can we take a tangent on one of these topics to talk about?
Depends on what the tangent is, and as I wrote in there, if I sense you did it for another class, I will be extremely upset.
Sure, I understand that.
It would have to be very clear to me that you are doing a paper for this class. It's my major right such things. So I would check it with you when you figure out what tangent you're thinking of.
Okay. Well, I don't know yet, but
okay.
I just was curious.
Yeah, right. Open to that, but only after discussion.
Sounds like getting tender?
No. You can only do that. You make it up by 2 points. You make up the missing of the class. What happens with the quiz when you class is you can't subtract you're allowed to subtract. You're allowed to subtract. Right. You're allowed to subtract. You won't be able to subtract. There's no way to make that. Okay? All right. Go up. We have two items on the same thing. Just follow the directions on the paper. I'm glad you came. Did more come with you? Good. Wonderful. How you doing, sir? Right, the most important right now. So that's another thing.
Yeah, but I'm saying that last week. But that's what that was about, is that I tried to start this math, and when I found out it was wrong, this is the problem I'm getting in, is the hospital that I could go in.
No, you can still try to get in.
Okay, but
You can get in. You can get in.
Okay.
On a credit basis. You can still get in.
Actually, I wanted to take this as audit fund, so I was thinking that I was taking it, but
Fine, you can order, but you have to go through the thing that you, yeah. Okay. All right, good to have you. I will, other people. Other people. Good to see you. How are you? I've been trying, looking forward to it too. Good. I'm glad. Now the class in here starts when, do you know? Tom, thank you. You know that 18 of those stay in this room here? 18 of these here? I think so. Stay in that little room there. Okay.